At first, they thought thunder was just pawing at the dust. Horses do that sometimes when the flies are bad, or when the ground is hard. But the summer had been dry for too long. The water barrels were empty. And then the horse began to dig, and what he uncovered would save the whole homestead. The small family had been on the plains for 3 years now. When they first arrived, the grass had stood tall and the creek had still held water. John had meant to dig a proper well that first year, but each season had brought work that seemed more urgent than the last. Fences needed setting, a cabin needed raising, and the land demanded more labor than a man could ever quite finish. Now summer had come hard and dry, and the well still had not been dug. This was the first drought they had faced. Martha watched the water carefully. They had been conserving for weeks, measuring every bucket and saving what they could. Water barrels stood beside the house, beneath the eaves, their wooden lids waiting for a storm that never came. Inside the small cabin, warm air drifted slowly through the open windows. The breeze carried dust with it, leaving a fine layer across the table and floor. It was the price they paid for a little relief from the heat. Their son Jacob was 13 now, growing fast and carrying a boy's hearty appetite that the shrinking garden could no longer satisfy. The plants that once promised a good harvest now stood tired and gray in the heat, their leaves curling inward as if trying to protect themselves from the relentless sun. One afternoon, Jacob knelt beside the struggling rows, studying what little was still alive. Near the end of one row, he noticed a small sweet potato plant that had managed to push out a thin green slip despite the heat. He pinched it off carefully and carried it to the house. Inside, Martha stood at the wash basin, finishing the dishes with the last of the day's water. "What have you got there?" she asked. Jacob held up the small green cutting. "Sweet potato slip," he said. "Maybe we can start another plant." Martha looked at the little stem in his hand. "With what water?" she asked gently. Jacob hesitated, then glanced at the basin. When Martha stepped away, he reached in and filled a small cup with the cloudy dishwater. He set the slip inside and placed the cup on the window ledge where the sun still reached through the glass. It wasn't much, but it was something. From then on, whenever there was a little water left in the basin, Jacob added it to the cup. Days passed. Tiny white roots began to grow, but the rain had not come. John rode into town one afternoon, hoping to trade for feed or hear word of rain somewhere to the north. The road lay quiet beneath the sun, dust rising slowly behind his horse. Near the livery stable, a long wooden trough stood beside the street. The water inside was low and cloudy, stirred by the noses of horses that had already passed through town that day. John dismounted and pulled the bucket from his saddle. A hand pump creaked slowly beside the trough, its iron handle rising and falling as an old man worked it with tired arms. Each stroke sent a thin stream of water splashing into the basin. John waited until the horses finished drinking. When the trough settled, he knelt and dipped the bucket beneath the surface, careful not to stir the mud at the bottom. The water was warm and dirty, but it would keep the horses another day. The old man at the pump glanced over. "Dry everywhere," he said. John nodded. "Same at our place." The man gave the pump another slow pull, and the iron handle groaned. "Reckon something's gotta give?" John tied the bucket back to his saddle and turned toward the livery yard. That was when he heard shouting and the sharp crack of a whip. A small crowd of men had gathered around the corral. Their shirts were dark with sweat, and the heat had worn patience thin. Inside the fence, a tall bay horse circled hard against the rails, its sides heaving, its ears pinned back. Each time the man with the whip stepped forward, the horse wheeled away, refusing to lower its head or stand still. "Won't break," one of the men muttered. "Been at him half the day," another said. "Stubborn brute." The whip cracked again. The horse flinched but did not move his feet. Instead it turned and faced the man, standing square, its dark eyes fixed on him. There was something steady in the animal's gaze, as if it were weighing the men. John watched the horse carefully. The animal was lean from the dry summer, but the bones were good and the legs strong. There was spirit in it, too much spirit for men who wanted an easy animal. Someone laughed. "He'll either break tomorrow or we'll break trying." John stepped closer to the fence. Whose horse is it? Traded in this morning, a man answered. No use to anyone if he won't take the saddle. John studied the horse again, the way it held its ground even after the lash. He knew bringing another animal home made little sense. Feed was already thin, and water thinner still. But some things a man could not stand and watch. Before the sun set that evening, John was leading the horse out of town. Martha saw the animal coming long before John reached the house. She stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "John," she said quietly. He knew what she meant before she finished. "He'd have been whipped half to death by tomorrow," John said. Martha looked at the horse, then at the dry pasture beyond the fence. "That makes 4 mouths now." John nodded. "I know." They said little more about it. On the plains, some decisions were made with the heart and paid for later. John poured the bucket slowly into the trough. The water spread thin across the bottom boards, barely enough to cover the wood. The horses stepped forward anyway, drinking carefully as if they knew every drop mattered. Jacob watched the new horse carefully from the fence. The animal stood tense inside the corral, nostrils wide, eyes always watching. He did not trust them yet. Jacob began spending time near the fence in the evenings, sitting quietly on the rail while the horse paced. One evening, the horse struck the gate hard with its shoulder, the boards rattling against the latch. Jacob laughed softly. "You make more noise than a summer storm." The horse stopped and looked at him. "Well, maybe that's what I'll call you," Jacob said after a moment. "Thunder." From then on, the boy spoke the name whenever he came to the fence. Little by little, Thunder began to stand a little closer when Jacob was near. The drought deepened. The garden weakened day by day. Bean vines curled inward. Squash leaves turned pale and brittle. Dust coated the plants so thick, Martha sometimes wiped them with a damp cloth before watering. Inside the cabin, the pantry shelves had begun to thin. The jars they had put up the year before were nearly gone now, and the few remaining cans sat spaced far apart as if trying to hide how little was left. One evening, Martha paused in the doorway and watched Jacob coming through the door. The boy's clothes hung loose on his frame now. He caught her looking and gave a small shrug. "I'm fine, Mom." Martha knew better, but she said nothing. John took the rifle out one morning and rode toward the scrub hills, hoping to find a rabbit or a stray deer. He returned near sunset with a small jackrabbit tied behind the saddle. It wasn't much, but Martha stewed the meat slowly with what little onion and dried beans she had left. Even the smallest meal felt like a blessing. The horses were feeling the drought as well. One evening, John carried the last bucket of water to the trough near the corral. The water barely covered the bottom boards. The 3 horses drank slowly, noses touching the shallow pool. Thunder stood apart at first, watching. Jacob leaned on the rail. "Go on," he said softly. "There's enough." When the other horses stepped back, Thunder lowered his head to drink. The water barely reached his lips. Jacob rubbed the horse's neck through the fence. "You're not so wild anymore." Thunder snorted softly but remained beside the rail. John had begun digging for water. He chose a spot near the place where a small spring had once run, back when they first settled the land. Day after day he drove the shovel into the hard earth, sweat running down his face as dust clung to his clothes and skin. The shovel struck dry soil again and again, never finding the damp ground he hoped for. A tumbleweed rolled past the fence, carried slowly by the steady wind. But the hole stayed dry. One evening, Martha set a small pan on the table. Inside were the last of the prickly pears she had gathered from the dry hills beyond the pasture. "There won't be more of those," she said quietly. Jacob hesitated, then went to the window and brought the cup from behind the jar. Inside the glass, the sweet potato slip had grown several bright green leaves. "We could eat these tomorrow," he said. Martha studied the small plant for a moment. "Maybe just a few," she said softly. They clipped the leaves carefully and cooked them in a stew the next night, leaving the roots untouched in the water. After supper, Jacob checked the plant. The small white roots were growing stronger now. He watched them for a long moment before blowing out the lamp. The next afternoon, John and Jacob walked toward the corral to check the horses. Thunder had grown more restless than usual. As John reached the gate, the horse lunged forward. The latch gave way and Thunder burst through, racing across the dry pasture. "Jacob!" John called. They ran after him, weak from heat and hunger but unwilling to lose the animal now. Thunder ran hard toward the low ground beyond the garden. Then suddenly he stopped. The horse lowered his head, sniffed the ground, and began pawing at the dirt. Dust flew as the hooves scraped deeper into the soil. John and Jacob reached the spot moments later. The horse slowed, snorting softly. John knelt and pressed his hand into the disturbed ground. The soil beneath the top layer felt cooler. "Get the shovel and a rope," he said. They dug slowly at first, then faster as the dirt grew darker. Dry soil turned to damp earth, then mud. At last, a small pool of water began to gather at the bottom of the hole. Jacob stared in disbelief. How did he know? John rested on the shovel and looked at the horse. "Son, horses have senses we don't understand. He must have smelled water from the corral." The horse stood beside them, breathing hard in the heat. John wiped the sweat from his face and looked at the animal. "Looks like he came to save us." The little spring continued to seep up from the earth, slowly filling the hole they had dug. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jacob returned to the house that evening and checked the cup by the window. The sweet potato slip had grown stronger roots. He carried it outside and planted it near the new spring. Behind him, John had already led Thunder back to the corral. The horse stood quietly now, watching the yard through the rails. Thunder had done his job, looking out for the herd. Across the dry plains, the wind still moved through the grassless fields. But for the first time in many weeks, water was gathering where the earth had been dry. And beside that small trickle of life, something green was beginning to grow again. Thunder lifted his head toward the sky and nudged Jacob's hand. The boy smiled and scratched the horse's neck, not yet knowing that the rain was on its way. Far out across the plains, beyond the low hills and the dry wind, thunder rolled quietly through the sky.